Three kids left home for the beach on a sunny January morning in 1966 and were never seen again. What happened in those missing hours still haunts an entire country. In the warm glow of a typical Australian summer morning, Adelaide's Glenelg Beach shimmered with promise. It was January 26, 1966, Australia Day, a public holiday, and the golden sand stretched out beneath the open sky, inviting families from across the city to relax, swim, and enjoy time together. Among those venturing out for a simple day of fun was the Beaumont family. Jim and Nancy Beaumont were like any other suburban couple. Living in Somerton Park, a quiet, middle-class suburb just a few miles from the beach, they had built a modest but loving home with their three children, Jane, aged 9, Arna, aged 7, and Grant, aged 4. Their neighborhood was safe. People left their doors unlocked. Children played freely in the streets. Danger, in any form, felt like a distant foreign concept. Jane was mature for her age, quiet, gentle, and caring. Arna, on the other hand, was the energetic one, a little spark of mischief and laughter. Grant, the youngest, was everyone's favorite, bright-eyed, curious, and fiercely attached to his sisters. Together, they formed a trio that turned heads wherever they went, always together, always smiling. That morning, Nancy had planned to accompany them to the beach, as she usually did. But the children, eager for independence and buoyed by Jane's maturity, begged to go alone. They had done it before, just once, and it had gone smoothly. The bus to Glenelg Beach took only 5 minutes. Jane knew the route. It seemed harmless. Jim, a traveling salesman, had left early that morning for work. Nancy, juggling a few household tasks, reluctantly agreed. She handed them some coins for bus fare and snacks and reminded Jane to watch her siblings closely. The children waved goodbye, walking hand in hand toward the bus stop. It was the last time Nancy would ever see them. They boarded the 10:10 a.m. bus with smiles and chatter, a small bag of towels and toys in hand. The plan was simple: spend a couple of hours at the beach and return home by midday. By 12 noon, Nancy stood at the front door, looking toward the street. No sign of them. By 12:15, a flicker of concern crossed her mind. Buses sometimes ran late. Maybe they lost track of time. Still, she waited. When 1 p.m. came and went, unease turned to dread. As the afternoon wore on, Grant Beaumont grew uneasy. It was now past 3 p.m., the time Jane, Arna, and Grant Jr. were expected back. Nancy had returned from her shopping trip by then and joined her husband in pacing around the home. They called out neighbors and checked the bus stop. But the beachgoers came and went, and still, there was no sign of their children. By 5 p.m., the creeping dread could no longer be ignored. Grant got into his car and drove the familiar route to Glenelg Beach. He scoured the shoreline, asking lifeguards, shopkeepers, and passers-by if they'd seen his kids. A few remembered seeing them earlier in the day, playing in the sand and laughing like any other summer group. But no one had seen them recently. Back home, the clock ticked toward 7:30 p.m., and the sun dipped lower, casting a golden haze over the city. It had now been hours since anyone had laid eyes on Jane, Arna, or Grant Jr. The Beaumonts called the police. The police arrived swiftly, treating the case with urgency. After all, this wasn't a simple case of kids losing track of time. Jane was a responsible girl, mature beyond her years, and had always followed the rules. Arna had her spirited moments, but she never strayed far from her older sister. And Grant Jr., just 4 years old, would not have ventured anywhere alone. By nightfall, search teams were mobilized. Officers combed the beach with flashlights, calling out the children's names. Divers swept the water, fearing a tragic accident might have occurred. Helicopters hovered above, sweeping spotlights across the sand and surrounding neighborhoods. No trace. The children had vanished as if the earth had swallowed them whole. As dawn broke on January 27th, the first real lead came from beachgoers interviewed the night before. Several witnesses recalled seeing the Beaumont children playing under the sun, but not alone. They were spotted with a tall blonde man in his 30s, athletic-looking, wearing swimming trunks. He was smiling, chatting with the kids, even helping them play in the surf. One woman recalled the man giving the younger boy piggyback rides. Another said he watched the kids' belongings while they went to get snacks. And someone else remembered Jane holding a crumpled $1 note. Odd, since her mother had only given her a few coins for the trip. Had the man given them extra money? None of the witnesses recalled seeing the man before, and none saw him leave. The sun had begun to shift in the sky by early afternoon, casting long shadows across the Glenelg beachfront. Nancy Beaumont paced the living room of her Somerton Park home, glancing frequently at the clock. Her children, Jane, Arna, and Grant, were expected back by midday. It was now past 2 p.m. She reminded herself that Jane, at 9 years old, was responsible beyond her years. Still, unease crept in. Nancy stepped outside to the street, scanning the sidewalk. No sign of them. She waited, minutes ticking by, each one sharpening her anxiety. By 3:00 p.m., she phoned Jim at work. The call was brief but tense. Jim rushed home and immediately began retracing the children's steps to Glenelg. He drove along Jetty Road, stopped at the beach, checked their usual haunts, the kiosk, the changing rooms, the lawn where kids gathered to play. Nothing. They approached neighbors, then strangers, then the police. At first, authorities were unconcerned. It wasn't unusual for kids to lose track of time. But Jim and Nancy were adamant. Something wasn't right. That evening, police took the report seriously and launched a search. Officers, volunteers, and even the local army base scoured the area through the night. By dawn, the terrifying realization had settled in. 3 children had seemingly vanished without a trace in broad daylight. As the news spread, Adelaide was stunned. This was a safe place. Children walked the streets alone, played in parks until dusk, caught buses to beaches without worry. The Beaumonts were a normal, loving family. There was no known reason anyone would target them. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers joined police in an exhaustive search of Glenelg and its surroundings: storm drains, abandoned buildings, dunes, even garden sheds. Dog squads were brought in. Dive teams searched nearby waters, but nothing turned up. The media swarmed. Newspapers splashed the story across front pages. Headlines screamed, "Hunt for the Beaumonts" and "3 vanish from Glenelg Beach." The children's photographs, Jane with her poised smile, Arna with her round cheeks, Grant's mischievous eyes, became etched into the nation's memory. Jim and Nancy gave interviews, often through tears. They clung to hope. Someone, somewhere, must have seen something. A breakthrough seemed possible when witnesses began reporting sightings. One woman recalled seeing the 3 children with a tall, thin man in his mid-30s at the Glenelg Beach Reserve. He had a sun-tanned complexion, and light brown hair swept back. The children appeared relaxed and even playful with him, not fearful. Jane was holding a book, believed to have been bought with a pound note that neither Jim nor Nancy had given her. It was possible the man had. Another witness saw the group walking along Jetty Road later that day, seemingly in high spirits. That was the last known sighting. This clue was both a lead and a puzzle. If the children had willingly followed the man, did they know him? Had they met him before? Nancy had made a chilling remark to a friend weeks earlier, something Jane had said after a beach trip. "We met a man there. He's really nice." Nancy hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now it haunted her. Police worked tirelessly to track this man, dubbed the Blonde Stranger by the press. Artists' sketches were released, but no solid leads emerged. The case quickly became the most high-profile disappearance in Australian history. Theories flourished, each more desperate than the last. 1. The familiar stranger theory. Could the man have groomed the children over weeks, gaining their trust? It would explain their comfort around him. 2. Abduction and trafficking. Some investigators suspected the children were taken for darker purposes, sold, smuggled, or harmed. Yet no ransom note ever came. No demands, only silence. 3. The accidental death cover-up. A stranger might have accidentally harmed one of them, a fall, a blow, an accident, and panicked, silencing the other two to avoid discovery. 4. The local predator theory. Several suspects emerged over the years, including known child predators living in or visiting Adelaide at the time. One was a man named Harry Phipps, whose estate had a private incinerator. Decades later, excavations on his property found no remains but did reveal suspicious evidence like disturbed soil. 5. The sighting years. Later. In 1968, 5 years after the disappearance, Jim and Nancy received a letter supposedly from Jane. It claimed she was alive and had run away to start a new life. The writer asked to meet, but when Jim arrived at the location, no one came. Forensic analysis later concluded the letter was a hoax, a cruel one. The 1970s came and went. The children would have been teenagers, then adults. Every year on their birthdays, Nancy baked cakes and kept their rooms tidy. They celebrated quietly, always leaving the lights on. Jim grew increasingly private. Nancy grew more fragile, haunted by endless what-ifs. Their marriage strained under the weight of hope and grief. In time, they separated, not out of lack of love, but from an unspeakable sadness that clung to every room. The investigation continued in waves. Each new tip reignited the public's attention. Psychics offered visions, suspects were interrogated. In 2013, bones were discovered near a factory once owned by a suspect. But they were animal remains. Not once did any concrete proof surface. The Beaumont case transformed how Australia viewed child safety. Doors that were once left open began to close. Parents watched their children more closely. Be home before dark became a rule, not a suggestion. The police techniques evolved. Missing persons units became better funded. Amber alerts and child protection laws gained ground. But for Jim and Nancy, these changes brought little solace. They had become the faces of a tragedy, with no resolution. Nancy passed away in 2019, still hoping her children might somehow be alive. Jim remains reclusive, rarely speaking publicly. They never held a funeral. Without answers, how could they? What really happened on that beach in 1966? Did the children climb into a stranger's car? Were they taken to a home, a shed, a basement? Did someone see something but never come forward? The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence, a void that the nation, even decades later, still struggles to fill. As the sun sets over Glenelg today, families still gather at the beach. Children play in the waves. But older generations glance around a little more often, their eyes searching for the unseen, their minds haunted by 3 names: Jane, Arna, Grant. The days turned into weeks, and the disappearance of Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont evolved from a tragic local mystery into a national obsession. Posters bearing their smiling faces were plastered across Adelaide and beyond. The beaches emptied. The laughter of children was replaced by an uneasy silence. For the first time, a nation known for its sense of safety and neighborly trust had been shaken to its core. News outlets couldn't get enough of the story. Every new headline brought with it both hope and heartbreak. "Where are the Beaumont children?" became a daily cry in newspapers. The public's reaction was fierce. People demanded answers from the police, from politicians, from anyone who would listen. Volunteers flooded into Glenelg, scouring dunes and alleyways. Entire neighborhoods organized search parties. And yet, as the sun set each night, the questions remained. How could 3 children vanish in broad daylight from a crowded beach? Who was the tall blonde man? Why was there no sign, no shoe, no doll, no trail? Inside the Beaumont household, time seemed to freeze. Jim sat quietly in the children's room each night, surrounded by the remnants of their lives. Drawings on the wall, toys on the shelves, and clothes still waiting to be worn. Nancy, once the smiling mother who walked her children to school each morning, now barely left her bed. Well-meaning strangers left flowers and notes. Some sent letters with cruel accusations. Others made anonymous calls, claiming to know where the children were, calls that led police on wild goose chases into abandoned buildings, remote woods, and once, even across state lines. But nothing ever panned out. Then came Gerard Croiset, a world-renowned Dutch psychic, flown in by wealthy benefactors desperate for a break in the case. Croiset claimed to see the children's bodies buried beneath a warehouse near the Adelaide airport. It was all the media could talk about. Cameras followed Croiset as he walked the area, eyes closed, muttering in Dutch. With public pressure mounting, authorities did the unthinkable. They demolished the warehouse's concrete floor. They found nothing. The psychic's failure didn't just waste resources, it deepened the hopelessness that had settled like fog over Adelaide. Detective Harry Griffin, the officer leading the investigation, became the face of a case spiraling out of control. He was competent, methodical, and dedicated, but he was also human. As tips poured in, most of them dead ends, the toll began to show. For every false lead, a family held onto a sliver of hope that was crushed, again and again. The police interviewed over 1,000 people. They followed up on more than 5,000 public reports. Nothing led to the children. The composite sketch of the blonde man was shared widely, but he was never identified. He had simply vanished, just like Jane, Arna, and Grant. Months later, police revisited early witnesses. One woman, Doreen, who ran a local snack bar, recalled something odd. On the day the children vanished, she saw Jane, the eldest, buy a meat pie and a large bottle of soft drink, items the children weren't known to have money for. More oddly, she paid with a $1 note. Nancy and Jim had only given them coins. Who gave Jane that $1 note? This detail was chilling. It suggested the children were with an adult at the time. But more importantly, it raised the possibility that this person had gained their trust, maybe even known them previously. And then there was the letter. About 2 years after the disappearance, Jim and Nancy received a letter, supposedly written by Jane. It claimed that she and her siblings were living happily with a man who loved them and was taking good care of them. It said they wanted to come home, and a meeting place was suggested. The handwriting matched Jane's. The tone was eerily familiar. Police took it seriously. Jim went to the arranged spot, heart pounding. No one came. Later, another letter arrived, this time from the supposed captor, saying the children had been taken away again because their safety was compromised. But forensic analysis would later confirm that the letters were a hoax. A man confessed years later to writing them. He was a teenager at the time, playing a cruel joke. He never met the Beaumonts. He never saw the children. As the years rolled on, the theories began to multiply. Some believed the children were abducted and murdered shortly after they vanished. Others were convinced they'd been sold into a pedophile ring, a dark network that preyed on innocence. A handful clung to hope that the children had been taken by someone who wanted a family, raised them in isolation, and that one day they might return. Grown, changed, but alive. One of the most disturbing theories revolved around a man named Bevan Spencer von Einem. He was later convicted of the murder of a 15-year-old boy in the 1980s and was suspected in a string of other child disappearances and deaths. Von Einem matched the general description of the blonde man. He lived in Adelaide. He was known to associate with powerful people in secretive circles. Some investigators suspected he may have been involved with others in a horrific series of crimes. But again, there was no direct link, no physical evidence, no confession, nothing that would bring the Beaumont case any closer to resolution. By the 1990s, Jim and Nancy had grown older, quieter. They rarely spoke to the press anymore. Their marriage, once strong, eventually collapsed under the weight of unspoken grief. They separated but always remained bound by one tragic thread: 3 children gone without explanation. In 2013, fresh hope emerged. A man claimed to have information that the children's bodies were buried beneath a factory near Adelaide. Ground-penetrating radar was used. Again, a concrete floor was torn apart. Again, nothing was found. What remains is not just a mystery, but a mirror, showing us what happens to a society when innocence is stolen and justice remains elusive. The Beaumont case changed Australia. It changed parenting. It changed law enforcement protocols. It changed how children were allowed to move through public spaces. The idea that a child could walk alone to a store or beach became almost unthinkable in the years after 1966. And for storytellers like us, for truth seekers and listeners around the world, it left a chilling reminder. Sometimes the real monsters don't live under the bed. They walk beside us, smile at our children, and vanish without a trace. The disappearance of Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont was more than a family tragedy. It became a national wound that would never fully heal. As days turned to years and decades, the mystery only deepened, pulling in conspiracy theories, false confessions, bizarre coincidences, and a trail of desperate hope that never quite led to closure. By the late 1970s, over a decade had passed since the children had vanished from Somerton Park Beach. The Beaumonts' faces were still etched into the national psyche. In homes across Australia, the story was passed on like folklore. Cautionary tales whispered to children about not trusting strangers or wandering off alone. Parents became more protective, and a cultural innocence was lost. It was as if the very idea of a safe neighborhood died that day in 1966. Yet, despite the passage of time, the police continued to chase leads, most going nowhere. Jim and Nancy Beaumont, steadfast in their sorrow, held on to every new piece of information with cautious hope. But as the years dragged on, they began to retreat from the public eye, their faces aged with heartbreak and exhaustion. Over time, several suspects emerged, each with varying degrees of credibility. One of the most discussed was Bevan Spencer von Einem, a convicted child murderer and a known predator operating in South Australia during the 1980s. His involvement in the family murders, a series of horrific crimes targeting teenage boys, made him a person of extreme interest. Some believed that his connections to a shadowy network of abusers in Adelaide made him capable of far more. However, concrete links to the Beaumont case never materialized. Another name that surfaced repeatedly was Derek Percy, a man institutionalized for the sadistic murder of a child in the late 1960s. Percy was known to have traveled frequently across Australia, and his documented presence in the region during the Beaumont's disappearance sparked serious concern. Still, the evidence remained circumstantial at best. And then, there was the possibility of an unknown predator, someone who had studied the children's habits, gained their trust over time, and orchestrated their abduction with chilling precision. The description of the man seen with the children that day, a tall, blond male in his 30s, matched no known offender conclusively. The psychological profile, however, was clear. He would have been charming, confident, someone who could seem harmless, perhaps even fatherly. He would know how to lure children without force, how to make them laugh and feel safe. And he would have needed a place, remote, private, where 3 children could be hidden, forever. The most tormenting developments in the case weren't the cold leads or endless dead ends. They were the cruel tricks played by strangers with no regard for the family's suffering. Over the years, several individuals stepped forward claiming to know the whereabouts of the children, or worse, confessing to being responsible. Some were mentally ill, others were simply seeking attention. One anonymous letter sent to Jim and Nancy in 1968 claimed the children were alive and being cared for in a commune. The letter included details that had never been publicly disclosed, prompting authorities to consider it seriously. But the trail, like so many others, collapsed into silence. In 1992, new hope surfaced when a man claimed he'd seen a stranger with 3 children in a panic near a construction site on the day of the disappearance. A search of the area turned up nothing. And in 2013, over 4 decades later, police excavated the site of a former factory in Adelaide based on a tip that the children's remains were buried in an old sand pit. The operation was watched by the world, but after days of digging, nothing was found. Each time hope was raised, it was crushed again. And each time, Jim and Nancy endured the pain of reopening wounds that had never fully healed. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the Beaumont mystery lies not just in what happened, but in what could have been. Jane, the eldest, would be in her 70s today. Arna would be approaching retirement. Grant, the youngest, might have had children of his own. Birthdays came and went, uncelebrated. Family milestones passed in silence. A lifetime of memories that never were. For Jim and Nancy, the loss went beyond their children. The trauma fractured their marriage. In the years following the disappearance, they struggled to maintain their bond, but the grief was too deep, too personal, and too enduring. They separated quietly, living out their later years in private sorrow. In an interview years later, Jim Beaumont said, "You can't explain the emptiness. It's like a hole in the center of your chest that never closes." Nancy rarely spoke to the media after the 1970s, retreating into a quiet life away from the glare of public attention. Even now, nearly 6 decades later, questions remain that torment investigators and armchair sleuths alike. Why did the children stay so long at the beach that day? Who was the man they were seen playing with? And why did they trust him? What happened between their last sighting and the moment their trail vanished? Some believe the children may have been taken overseas. Others think a local with access to resources and remote property may have kept them hidden, perhaps even raised them under different names. DNA databases, global alerts, and digital forensics have tried to pierce the fog of the past, but the case remains one of the most infamous unsolved disappearances in history. If there was one silver lining to this tragedy, it was the change it sparked. The case led to sweeping reforms in child safety awareness across Australia. Parents became more vigilant. Schools introduced programs on stranger danger. Authorities improved response protocols for missing children, realizing that every hour counted. The story of the Beaumont children also led to the creation of child abduction alert systems and helped pave the way for missing persons units to receive more funding and national coordination. In the years that followed, Australia's approach to child safety was forever shaped by this one unspeakable event. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and films have continued to explore the Beaumont mystery. Some tell the story with sympathy and care, others sensationalize it for entertainment. But for those closest to the case, the pain remains raw. The image of Jane, Arna, and Grant, captured forever in black and white photos smiling in their Sunday best, haunts every retelling. They are frozen in time, unchanging, as the world moves on. Even in 2024, social media occasionally reignites interest in the case, as new amateur sleuths attempt to uncover the truth. Reddit threads, YouTube channels, and investigative blogs analyze old photos and police statements, hoping to notice something that everyone else missed. There's one detail that continues to haunt investigators: the children's behavior on the morning of their disappearance. Jane, who was always known as responsible, had unexpectedly used her own money to buy snacks. This seemed out of character. Even more chilling was the report that she had told the storekeeper, "The man gave me money." Who was this man? And how did he know the Beaumonts' routine so well? Perhaps he had been watching for weeks, waiting for a day like this, waiting for just the right moment when trust, routine, and opportunity aligned. In the end, the case of the Beaumont children may never be solved. Perhaps the truth lies buried beneath layers of time, fear, and secrets. Or perhaps, as many still believe, someone out there knows exactly what happened and simply has never spoken. But one thing is certain: the disappearance of Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont changed a nation. Their story remains a chilling reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn extraordinary, and how even the most innocent of days can end in heartbreak. The years dragged on, yet the absence of Jane, Arna, and Grant never faded into the background. Adelaide had moved forward, the bustling city eventually finding a rhythm again. But for those closest to the Beaumont children, time had fractured in 1966, and it had never truly resumed. Every missing poster, every tip-off, every fleeting whisper of a lead was a fresh cut on wounds that never healed. Nancy and Jim Beaumont, once the portrait of a content Australian family, had become reluctant celebrities of tragedy. Reporters knocked on their door with the same urgency and shallow hope as they had in the days following the children's disappearance, though now the questions carried the weight of decades. Time hadn't dimmed the story. If anything, it gave it mythic power. The mystery of the Beaumont children became part of Australia's identity. But what remained for Nancy and Jim was far from myth. It was the empty beds. The school shoes never scuffed. The birthdays celebrated in silence. Jim had long retreated into himself, a quiet man who worked, ate, and slept, but did little else. Nancy, once luminous and quick-witted, now spoke in a slow hush, always watching the street outside, still expecting, praying, that her eldest daughter Jane might walk up the path. Detectives came and went, each generation bringing new technology and fresh eyes to the case. Files were reopened, examined, and scrutinized with modern forensics. But all the science in the world couldn't recreate a day that had vanished like smoke. Leads were sometimes promising. A man seen with 3 children at a coastal motel, a woman on a train who thought she'd overheard something, a boy's shorts found buried in an overgrown lot. But nothing stuck. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and those who had lived near Glenelg in 1966 slowly passed on. The most crucial pieces of the puzzle, if they ever existed, were already dust. Investigators struggled with their own demons. Detective Bill Harding, now retired, once confessed in an interview, "I dream about them. Sometimes I see their faces as we imagined them grown. Sometimes I find them in those dreams. But even there, I never bring them home." The Beaumont mystery became a grim touchstone for Australia. Every new missing child case was compared to it. Every documentary about unsolved crimes felt incomplete without a mention. The phrase, "like the Beaumont children," entered the lexicon, shorthand for the darkest kind of unresolved grief. True crime authors, conspiracy theorists, amateur sleuths, they all took their turns. Some meant well, others exploited the tragedy for gain. Every year, the anniversary of the children's disappearance saw spikes in internet searches, articles, and interviews. And every year, Nancy and Jim would brace themselves for the inevitable. Strangers at the gate, claims of sightings, or worse, someone peddling a new theory that suggested the children were still alive, hidden away. One day a letter arrived. It was postmarked from Victoria, written in messy blue ink. "I know where Jane is. She's been here all along, but she's not who you think she is anymore." The handwriting was shaky, the story incoherent, but the pain it caused was real. Nancy didn't eat for 2 days. Jim called the police, who traced the sender to a woman with long-standing mental health issues. Another dead end. Among the various suspects over the years, one name returned again and again. Bevan Spencer von Einem, a convicted murderer known for abducting and killing teenage boys in the late 1970s. Though von Einem was never formally linked to the Beaumont case, similarities in method and location kept his name alive in investigative circles. In 2007, a dying informant claimed he had seen von Einem with 2 other men in 1966, transporting children in the trunk of a car. That lead led to a property search in the Adelaide suburb of North Plympton, but nothing was found. Not a button, not a shoe. Still, for many, von Einem represented the shadow that had loomed over the city for too long, the personification of evil in a case where no resolution ever came. Even those who believed he wasn't the culprit agreed. Someone like him could have been. For all the effort poured into solving the case, there was a cost. Investigators burned out. Journalists who covered the case admitted to nightmares. Even ordinary citizens who became invested, following online forums, creating digital timelines, scouring archives, often found themselves overwhelmed by the emotional weight of the mystery. And for the families? Obsession came with its own torment. Nancy once admitted, in a rare televised appearance. Sometimes I think about what they'd be like now. Jane would be a mother, maybe. Arna, she always said she wanted to be a nurse. Grant, well, he was still just a little boy. I never really got to know who he would be. It was these thoughts more than anything that kept the pain fresh. Not just what had happened, but what could have been. In 2018, rumors of a potential burial site on a factory property in Adelaide made headlines. A group of researchers using ground-penetrating radar believed they had found anomalies consistent with disturbed Earth. For the first time in years, the possibility of closure felt within reach. The media descended. Police cordoned off the site. Jim and Nancy were advised to stay home, but they watched the live news broadcasts with bated breath. Could this be it? Could the decades of agony finally give way to answers? The dig lasted 2 days. Bones were found, but they were animal remains, likely a long-dead dog or sheep. Nothing human, nothing helpful, nothing at all. And with that, another chapter in the story closed, not with revelation, but with silence. Though no evidence ever surfaced, the Beaumont case transformed Australian society. In its aftermath, parents became more cautious. Child safety became a topic of national policy. Laws were passed, procedures improved. The public's trust, in each other, in institutions, in the very idea of safety, was never the same. And yet, for all that changed, one thing remained: the image of 3 smiling children walking hand in hand along a beach frozen in time. In the final years of her life, Nancy wrote a letter she never sent. It was addressed to her children, sealed in an envelope and kept in the drawer beside her bed. After her passing in 2019, the letter was found by a family friend, who later shared its contents with the public in an effort to preserve Nancy's memory. Jane, Arna, Grant, if you're still out there, I want you to know that not a day passed where I didn't think of you. I've imagined every version of you growing up. I've seen you walk through the front door so many times in my dreams. And I've prayed, oh, how I've prayed, that if you're somewhere in this world you're loved, I will find you in the next life. I promise. The sun had set long ago on that haunting day in 1966, but for the people of Australia, and especially for the Beaumonts, its shadow never lifted. The children's disappearance had frozen a moment in time, but the world moved forward. Cities grew taller, streets grew busier, and generations came and went. Yet the case of Jane, Arna, and Grant remained like a quiet ghost, whispering in the ears of those who remembered, and beckoning to those who came after. As the years stretched into decades, the Beaumont case became more than a tragedy. It evolved into a defining national mystery. For new parents, it became a lesson in vigilance. For investigators, it was a painful benchmark: what happens when every clue disappears. And for the media, it became a story retold again and again, often without answers, always with heartache. By the 1980s, new detectives had joined the South Australian police force. Many of them had grown up hearing the names of the Beaumont children before they ever wore a badge. The case was assigned to fresh eyes more than once, each detective sifting through the dust-covered files, each one hopeful that perhaps a missed detail would point to a breakthrough. Around this time, attention shifted toward new suspects, men with troubling histories who had lived in or passed through Adelaide around the time of the disappearance. Rumors surfaced, linking the case to figures like Bevan Spencer von Einem, who had been convicted of murder in 1984 and was suspected in multiple unsolved disappearances. Although connections were investigated, no conclusive evidence tied von Einem to the Beaumonts. Meanwhile, a fresh wave of public interest surged. Books and television specials re-examined the case. The children's photographs, now colorized and digitally restored, were printed in anniversary articles with speculative headlines: "Where are they now?" and "Australia's Lost Innocence." These features often reignited tips from the public, some sincere, some cruel, many just noise. Every few months, Nancy Beaumont would receive another anonymous letter, another late-night call, Another whispered theory in the supermarket aisle. Hope and heartbreak danced endlessly. As the world entered the digital age, cold case detectives gained new tools. Fingerprint databases, DNA matching, and international coordination through Interpol opened once closed doors. Investigators returned to every item of evidence from 1966. But that was the problem. There was so little evidence to examine. No clothing, no blood, no remains. Not even the children's belongings had ever been recovered. The meticulous records of early 1960s police work were not always preserved with the same rigor as today's standards. Some files were faded or lost. Interviews had been taken without audio recordings. Memories had shifted, and some key witnesses had died. Still, the development of age progression technology gave the case new momentum. For the first time, the public could see what Jane, Arna, and Grant might look like as adults. The images were haunting, composite sketches filled with guesswork and digital assumptions. Yet they rekindled national interest. Police received hundreds of calls in the weeks that followed the release of the sketches. A man in Perth claimed to have met a woman named Jane, who shared too many details to be a coincidence. A woman in Auckland said she recognized Arna's face in the eyes of a neighbor's daughter. Each lead was investigated. None held. But beneath the surface, something began to shift. For the first time in years, the public wasn't just asking where the children were. They were asking why the case had never been solved. Jim and Nancy Beaumont's marriage, once filled with laughter and daily chaos from their children, had long since fallen into silence. By the late 1990s, they had divorced. Neither remarried. Their shared loss had become too heavy to bear together. And yet, they never turned away from the search. Nancy continued to keep her children's bedrooms intact for decades. She refused to move out of their home. Every holiday, every birthday, she would sit in the living room and stare at the photos lining the mantel. A young girl with confidence beyond her years, a mischievous middle sister, a carefree little boy with a toothy smile. In rare interviews, Nancy's voice would tremble when she said their names. "I just want to know," she would say, "even if it's bad. Even if they're gone. I just want to know what happened." Jim, quieter and more reclusive, focused on writing letters. To police departments. To forensic experts. Even to psychics. Desperation had long blurred the lines between science and belief. In 2006, a chilling tip led to an excavation at a North Plimpton factory once owned by a known pedophile. Cadaver dogs were brought in. The earth was disturbed. Media cameras lined the streets for days, hoping for a breakthrough. But the search turned up nothing. No bones. No evidence. No trace. Another excavation was launched in 2013 at a different location tied to a different suspect. Again, nothing. And then in 2018, another dig, this time based on a detailed map allegedly drawn by a former associate of one of the suspects. That too proved fruitless. Each attempt chipped away at public optimism, but not at Nancy's. Even in her 90s, she held on. "I think," she told a reporter once, "that when I pass on, the truth will come." By 2020, the Beaumont story was no longer just a mystery. It had become folklore. High school students studied the case in criminal justice courses. True crime podcasts dedicated episodes to it. Filmmakers reimagined the tragedy in fictional stories that mirrored the pain, but offered fictional closure. The children had become symbols of vulnerability, of national innocence lost, of a time when kids played without fear and the whole country watched over each other's children, until one day that faith was broken. Some people criticized the media's obsession with the case, asking why so much attention went to one family while other missing children were forgotten. But others pointed to the sheer inexplicability of it, the daylight, the public setting, the absence of any clue. It was the kind of crime that didn't just haunt, it defied. Then in 2022, a surprising twist. An anonymous email was sent to a South Australian journalist claiming knowledge of what had happened to the children. The sender described a remote property outside Adelaide, a place never searched before. Police took it seriously. Maybe because of the detail, maybe because after decades, even faint hope was worth chasing. A drone survey and ground-penetrating radar were deployed. The property owner allowed full access. The media descended. But again, no trace, not even a clue. Investigators later revealed the email had been traced to a European IP address. A cruel hoax, they said. Another wound reopened. The Beaumont case remains open. It is the longest-running missing persons case in Australian history. The children would now be in their 60s. Their parents, if still alive, would be nearing a century old. There are no confirmed suspects, no definitive timeline. Only a moment, January 26, 1966, that continues to echo. And in that echo are the questions that will never stop being asked. Who took them? Why? How did they disappear so completely? And will anyone ever answer? By the late 1970s, more than a decade had passed since Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont disappeared. The once vivid flyers had yellowed, and the flood of tips that once overwhelmed investigators had slowed to a trickle. Yet the shadow of that fateful Australia day never truly left Adelaide, or the nation. In the Beaumont household, the silence had become routine. Grant and Nancy remained under the same roof, but it was as if they inhabited separate worlds. The laughter that once echoed down the halls had been replaced by an unspoken truce of grief. Nancy would still set the table for 5. Grant would still glance out the window at the garden as though expecting his children to run through it barefoot, calling for lemonade. But the world outside kept spinning. Children were born, others went missing, cases opened and closed, but the Beaumont mystery endured. What had begun as a local tragedy had transformed into a national obsession. Despite the absence of new leads, the case was never officially closed. Over the years, it would be reopened more than a dozen times, each time ignited by a new theory, a new suspect, or the latest advancement in forensic science, but none ever brought resolution. In 1998, a particularly chilling lead emerged. 2 brothers came forward with a harrowing tale. They claimed that during their childhood in the 1960s, they had witnessed 3 children being buried by a man in a trench behind a now-demolished Adelaide factory. Their recollection was vivid and traumatic, but more than 30 years had passed. The property in question had once belonged to Harry Phipps, a wealthy and eccentric local businessman with ties to the Glenelg area. Several witnesses claimed Phipps bore a strong resemblance to the man seen with the Beaumont children on the day they vanished. One of the most unsettling allegations? That the children had been seen entering his yard. In 2013, after intense public pressure, ground-penetrating radar was used to survey the site. Hopes soared. Excavation began, but nothing was found. No bones, no clothing, not even a single shoelace. The public deflation was palpable. With the advent of the internet and forums like Reddit and Websleuths, the case took on a second life. Ordinary people, students, retirees, even amateur sleuths, pored over old files, maps, timelines, and autopsy reports. Everyone had a theory. Some claimed the children had been taken by a traveling cult. Others believed a high-ranking figure in society had orchestrated the abduction and cover-up. A few even clung to the hope that the children had survived, spirited away to be raised under new identities, unaware of their origins. These theories spawned YouTube videos, podcasts, and articles. Some dug into long-forgotten suspects. Others questioned whether the original investigation had been tainted by bias, incompetence, or even corruption. But behind every theory was the same gnawing truth. No bodies, no evidence, no closure. Few people carried the burden of the Beaumont case more than the detectives who tried, again and again, to solve it. One of them was Detective Stanley Lawton, a respected figure in the South Australian police. He'd joined the force 2 years after the disappearance and inherited the case in the late 1970s. Even decades later, Lawton kept a file drawer at home, labeled simply, Beaumont. Inside were yellowed photographs, interview transcripts, and newspaper clippings worn thin by time and handling. Sometimes, he once told a reporter, I think about giving up. But then I remember their faces, those smiles. And I can't. Lawton died in 2004, the case still unsolved. By the 1990s, the Beaumont's marriage had quietly dissolved. They never filed for divorce. There were no legal proceedings, just a slow, inevitable drift apart. Jim moved to another suburb and rarely spoke to the press. Nancy remained in the family home until age and memory began to fade her sharp edges. In 2019, she passed away, taking with her a mother's eternal question. What happened to my children? Neither parent had ever been charged, accused, or officially suspected in the case, but they were not immune to whispers. Over the years, both faced invasive questions, cruel speculation, and insinuations. The grief, already unbearable, was made heavier by judgment. Yet those who knew them best always said the same thing. They never stopped hoping. In 2018, the South Australian Police Cold Case Review Team took another look at the Beaumont file. Advances in DNA technology promised new hope. Hair samples, once considered useless, were retested. Witness interviews were reevaluated using modern profiling techniques. But the results were the same. Detective Inspector Denise Gray, head of the review team, expressed the frustration of many. We have the names, the dates, the sightings, but what we don't have is proof. We're one piece short of the puzzle. Gray's team digitized the entire case file, including thousands of pages of statements, letters, and tips. They created a timeline so detailed it could account for nearly every minute of that Australia day, except the ones that mattered most. The Glenelg beach has changed since 1966. The kiosk is gone. The lawns are better manicured. A bronze sculpture now stands nearby, 3 children holding hands, looking out at the sea. It is not labeled, but everyone knows who it honors. Visitors still come. Some are tourists, others true crime pilgrims. They walk the route the children took. They pause at the corner where the last sighting was made. Some leave flowers, a few light candles. Most just stand in silence. They're not just mourning Jane, Arna, and Grant. They're mourning what was lost. A time when children could walk to the beach without fear, when trust came easily, and innocence felt unshakable. The disappearance of the Beaumont children had a profound effect on Australia. It changed how parents watched over their kids. It changed how police responded to child abductions, and it altered the national psyche in ways that linger to this day. After 1966, stranger danger became a common phrase. Community trust gave way to caution, and every missing child case that followed was haunted by the question, could this be another Beaumont? Despite the decades, despite the dead ends and false hopes, the story remains a staple of Australian folklore. It's taught in criminology classes. It's been fictionalized in novels and dramatizations. But no interpretation captures the full weight of it. Because the ending is still missing. Every few years someone claims to have seen them, alive, grown up, sometimes overseas. And every few years those claims are investigated, often with quiet desperation, but always ending the same. As one journalist wrote in a reflective piece on the 50th anniversary, "The Beaumont children are Australia's lost innocence, our open wound. We've aged, but the pain hasn't. Time buries many things, but it has never buried the memory of Jane, Arna, and Grant. As long as their story remains untold, we keep searching, not just for them, but for the truth we lost with them." The days turned into weeks, then into months. Adelaide, once known for its quiet coastal charm, was now a city gripped by fear, speculation, and sorrow. Despite exhaustive efforts, not a single trace of Jane, Arna, or Grant Beaumont had been found. The sand dunes held no answers. The witnesses' memories began to blur, and the leads that had once sparked hope dissolved into dead ends. But the country had changed. Something within the Australian psyche fractured the day the Beaumont children vanished. Parents no longer left their children alone at the beach. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted shut. The innocence of the era was over, replaced by an undercurrent of suspicion that never truly faded. 2 years after the disappearance, in 1968, the Beaumont family received a series of unexpected letters. Postmarked from Victoria, the handwriting was neat, controlled, and disturbingly detailed. The writer claimed to be Jane Beaumont. In the letters, she described how she and her siblings had been living with a man in good health, how they were safe and how they wanted to come home. But there was a catch. The man, she claimed, would not allow them to leave unless her parents met him. Jim and Nancy, clinging to any thread of hope, followed the instructions laid out in the letters. They drove to the arranged meeting place, waited in anxious silence, only for no one to appear. More letters followed, this time from the supposed man himself, mocking their pain. Eventually, the correspondence stopped, and with it, the fragile hope that the children might still be alive. Years later, forensic analysis confirmed what many feared. The letters were a cruel hoax, written by a teenager who later confessed. He was never charged, but the damage was done. As years passed, attention shifted toward potential suspects. Several names emerged over time, men with dark pasts and disturbing patterns. Some were already convicted of crimes against children. Others were rumored to be involved in underground rings. But none of the leads ever solidified into charges. One man in particular stood out, Bevan Spencer von Einem. Convicted of murdering a 15-year-old boy in the 1980s, he became a figure of public suspicion regarding the Beaumont case. His connections to other disappearances, his proximity to Adelaide, and his disturbing psychological profile seemed too close to dismiss. Yet, again, the evidence was circumstantial at best. Investigators could never establish a definitive link between him and the 1966 disappearances. Another theory centered on a man named Arthur Stanley Brown, a suspect in the 1970 disappearance of 2 young sisters in Townsville. He bore a resemblance to sketches drawn from eyewitness accounts in the Beaumont case. But Brown was in his 80s by the time he was formally suspected, and he died before any charges could be laid. A key piece of the mystery was the sighting of the children with a tall blonde man at Glenelg Beach. Eyewitnesses claimed the man was friendly, even joking with the kids as though he knew them. Later reports suggested he helped them buy snacks, items that Jane wouldn't normally purchase unless instructed. In retrospect, the witnesses' accounts were chilling. The children appeared relaxed, trusting, even happy, as if they had seen this man before. But who was he? Composite sketches circulated, but none led to definitive identification. Some speculated he was a local. Others believed he could have been a traveling predator, someone who had stalked the beach for days, waiting for the right moment. The real question was this: had the Beaumont children been groomed in the days leading up to their disappearance? Had the stranger slowly earned their trust until the moment he struck? By the 1970s, amateur sleuths, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts began to pick apart the case, convinced the official investigation had missed something. Conspiracy theories surfaced. Some believed the children had been abducted by a child trafficking ring. Others speculated they had been taken overseas. A few insisted they were still alive, living under assumed names, unaware of their past. The most enduring theory, however, was far darker: that the children had been murdered soon after their abduction and buried in a secret location. Without bodies, there was no closure, no certainty, only pain. In 2013, nearly 5 decades after the children vanished, a new lead emerged. An excavation was carried out at a factory site in North Plimpton, previously owned by a man named Harry Phipps, another person of interest who had been mentioned in witness accounts. Former workers claimed they had seen children digging a hole at the site around the time of the disappearance. Media flooded the area. The country held its breath. But once again, nothing was found. No bones, no clothing, just dirt and shattered hope. Jim and Nancy Beaumont never moved from their Somerton Park home, never changed their phone number in case their children tried to contact them. Over time, they stopped speaking to the press, weary of the constant cycle of hope and heartbreak. Their marriage suffered under the weight of grief, and eventually they separated. But neither remarried. Neither gave up entirely. Nancy passed away in 2019. Jim, still alive at the time of her passing, remained reclusive, his voice absent in the public discussion, a man forever haunted by what could not be known. Why does the Beaumont case still grip Australia and the world nearly 60 years later? Because it's not just about a disappearance. It's about the death of an age. The moment when a society that trusted in open beaches, neighborly strangers, and carefree afternoons realized that monsters sometimes wear familiar faces. It's a story with no ending, no resolution, only a haunting silence where three young voices once laughed and played. In the years following the various promising yet ultimately fruitless leads, the sense of urgency surrounding the disappearance of Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont never truly faded. Public interest might have wavered at times, but for detectives assigned to the cold case, and especially for the children's parents, Nancy and Jim, the pain remained as fresh as it had been in 1966. Each year brought new theories, false confessions, and occasional glimmers of hope, none of which ever crystallized into closure. One such moment came in 1998, more than 3 decades after the children had vanished. A convicted child sex offender named Bevan Spencer Von Einem was serving a life sentence for the murder of 15-year-old Richard Kelvin, a case that bore eerie similarities to the Beaumont disappearance. Von Einem's known methods included luring boys into his car, drugging them, and later disposing of their bodies in a meticulous, calculated manner. Investigators found chilling accounts in his diaries, fantasies that referenced 3 children being taken at once. Though never explicitly naming the Beaumonts, the details were enough to reignite interest. The South Australian police re-examined evidence and combed over old interviews with renewed vigor. Some former officers even broke their silence, frustrated that earlier clues had been ignored or dismissed. Yet, despite the profile aligning in disturbing ways, no physical evidence could link Von Einem to the disappearance. The public, however, once again felt the raw sting of the loss, reigniting collective grief and suspicion. Around the same time, rumors began to swirl around another potential suspect, Derek Percy. A known child killer, Percy had murdered a 12-year-old girl in 1969 and was suspected of several other abductions and killings. His name frequently appeared in forums and newspaper columns dissecting unsolved crimes across Australia. Like Von Einem, Percy had the background and opportunity. But most compelling of all, he had been in Adelaide in January 1966. Journalists uncovered circumstantial connections, maps, travel receipts, even an eyewitness report of a man matching his description near Glenelg Beach on the day of the disappearance. When questioned, Percy was uncooperative. He neither confirmed nor denied his involvement, often lapsing into cryptic or non-committal answers. To many, this was as close to a confession as the family might ever get. But again, investigators lacked the hard proof. Percy died in custody in 2013, taking any secrets he held with him to the grave. Yet another dead end. Over the decades, forensic techniques improved dramatically, and with them came renewed attempts to apply modern science to old clues. A major turning point came in 2013, when a man named Harry Phipps posthumously became the subject of police interest. A wealthy Adelaide businessman with alleged ties to pedophile networks, Phipps had been named by his own son as a possible suspect. According to the son, on the day of the disappearance he had seen 3 children in his father's yard, matching the ages and descriptions of the Beaumont children. Furthermore, 2 men had reportedly been paid by Phipps to dig a trench in his factory yard around the same time. The chilling implication that the children might be buried on that very property sparked immediate police action. In 2013, cadaver dogs were brought to the location and reacted strongly to a specific area. Ground-penetrating radar indicated anomalies in the soil beneath. Hope surged through Adelaide and beyond. Could this finally be it? Excavations began with a press frenzy encircling the scene. Days passed. Journalists camped out, families prayed, and aging detectives watched with breath held. But the dig produced only animal bones. The disappointment was crushing. Another cruel chapter in an already heart-wrenching story. Still, many couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was within reach, just out of grasp, hidden behind years of missteps and overlooked details. By now, Jim and Nancy Beaumont had long since retreated from public life. Their marriage had not survived the years of trauma, guilt, and relentless public scrutiny. They divorced quietly in the late 1970s, each living out their years in separate corners of South Australia. Nancy, who had always been the quieter of the two, avoided interviews. Jim, occasionally more vocal, shared his regrets with those close to him, chief among them the belief that their children might have returned home if they hadn't felt pressure to be punctual. Time had not healed them, only silenced their grief. The police, however, were not done. In the early 2000s, a cold case team was formed specifically to reevaluate South Australia's most haunting unsolved crimes. Armed with digital databases, upgraded forensic labs, and modern psychological profiling techniques, they pored over every inch of the Beaumont file. Witness testimonies were re-interviewed, timelines reconstructed. One key piece of evidence was a letter sent to the Beaumonts in 1966 and again decades later, purportedly from Jane herself. It detailed a supposed escape and a new life under an assumed identity. For a brief moment, even the police believed it might be real. Handwriting analysis seemed to match, and the writing contained specific details not publicly known. But, cruelly, it was revealed to be a hoax, crafted by a man who admitted he just wanted to see if it would work. He was later charged and convicted, but the damage had already been done. Each hoax eroded public trust and further traumatized those involved. Meanwhile, Glenelg Beach, once a symbol of childhood joy, became a site of quiet mourning. Tourists still flocked to its shores, unaware of the shadow it cast for those who remembered. On the 50th anniversary of the disappearance, a small vigil was held near the spot where Jane, Arna, and Grant were last seen. Flowers were placed in the sand. Strangers held hands. No speeches were given. There was nothing new to say. But for many, the Beaumont children had become something more than victims. They were symbols of lost innocence, a generation's turning point from carefree trust to watchful suspicion. After their disappearance, Australian parenting shifted. Freedom became supervision. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted tight. The story remains painfully unfinished. There are no bodies, no arrests, and no final answers. Only a growing archive of possibilities, theories, and heartbreak. But there is also a fierce resolve not to forget, not to let the story fade into myth. Because somewhere out there, the truth still exists. As the decades rolled on, the story of the Beaumont children refused to fade quietly into the recesses of forgotten tragedies. It had woven itself into the very fabric of Australian consciousness, an open wound that refused to heal. Every passing year brought new theories, renewed public interest, and yet, still, no definitive answers. Here we examine the legacy left behind, the scars etched into the nation's memory, and the persistent hope that justice, though long delayed, might still one day arrive. The world had changed dramatically since that sunny January day in 1966. Cities expanded, technology advanced, and yet the picture of Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont remained frozen in time. 3 smiling children forever caught in the innocence of youth. With each passing year, the case became not just a personal tragedy for the Beaumont family, but a haunting symbol for an entire generation of Australians who remembered exactly where they were when they first heard the news. One of the most chilling aspects of the Beaumont case was how it reshaped the national psyche. Before 1966, children were often allowed to roam freely in their neighborhoods, to catch buses unsupervised, to visit friends and explore the world around them. But after the disappearance of the Beaumont children, a palpable shift occurred. Parents grew more cautious. Strangers were viewed with heightened suspicion. The freedom of childhood was subtly but permanently altered. It's difficult to overstate the cultural impact of the case. In newspapers, documentaries, talk shows, and crime panels, The Beaumont children remained a focal point. Every new disappearance of a child in Australia brought a renewed flurry of interest in the case. Comparisons were drawn. Could it be connected? Could this new tragedy offer clues to the old one? Often the answer was no, but that didn't stop the speculation. By the early 2000s, investigative journalism had taken on a fresh urgency. A younger generation of reporters and documentarians began combing through old files, searching for overlooked details or gaps in the police investigation. Some even discovered previously unreleased notes or images that suggested leads that were never pursued. But even with modern forensic technology and the advent of digital crime-solving techniques, the core facts remained unchanged. The children went to the beach, and they never came home. There was a sense of helplessness that blanketed the case. It was as if the truth lay just beyond reach, hidden beneath layers of time, silence, and perhaps willful concealment. Some believed the authorities had not done enough in the early hours of the disappearance. Others pointed to the fact that massive media coverage may have actually hindered the investigation, turning potential witnesses into attention seekers or silencing those too afraid to come forward. Then there were the theories, by now numbering in the dozens, from organized child abduction rings to local predators hiding in plain sight, to wild notions of espionage or international trafficking. Each theory came with its own army of believers, but none had yielded proof. One of the more persistent threads in recent years centered around the possibility that the perpetrator may have been someone known to the children, possibly even someone respected in the community. This would explain why the children were so at ease, seen laughing and playing in public before vanishing. It would also explain the confidence the abductor had, boldly removing 3 children in broad daylight from a popular beach. Despite decades passing, the South Australian police kept the case open. Investigators, both old and new, often returned to the files with fresh eyes. Cold case units ran fingerprint checks, DNA tests, and followed up on hundreds of tips that trickled in year after year. Many of the original detectives had retired or passed on, but the flame had been carried forward by successors who treated the case not just as an unsolved file, but as a duty. In 2018, there was renewed attention when investigators excavated a site in North Plympton linked to convicted pedophile Harry Phipps. Despite the excitement and extensive digging, no human remains were found. It was another dead end, another wave of heartbreak for the family, and for a public still desperately seeking closure. By now, Jim and Nancy Beaumont were in their 80s. Their lives had been shaped entirely by the loss of their children. The strain had caused their marriage to dissolve many years earlier, though they remained in contact. Both had, at times, spoken publicly about their loss, but rarely. In interviews, their grief was still palpable. Neither had ever left Adelaide. Neither had ever stopped hoping. Nancy passed away in 2019. Jim followed not long after. They died without answers, without knowing what happened to Jane, Arna, and Grant. Their final years were quiet, reflective. Friends and relatives described them as gentle people who bore the unimaginable with grace. But even in death, their story lived on. Today, the case remains one of the most famous child disappearances in world history. It has been studied by criminologists, profiled in university lectures, and dissected in forums by amateur sleuths. The Beaumont children, in a tragic way, became Australia's lost innocence, a stark reminder of how quickly the world can change in a single afternoon. And still, hope flickers. In the age of advanced DNA tracing, forensic genealogy, and public data sharing, even the oldest cold cases have a chance. Cases once thought unsolvable have been cracked wide open decades later. The arrest of the Golden State Killer in the United States proved that time is not always the enemy of justice. Some believe that one day, a forgotten photograph, a misplaced item, or a passing remark could finally unlock the mystery that has haunted Australia for over half a century. Because stories like this never really die. They wait. In dusty files. In fading photographs. in the memories of those still alive who might know something but have never spoken. The silence around the Beaumont case is loud, but maybe, just maybe, that silence can still be broken. So what keeps people coming back to this story? Maybe it's the unshakable feeling that someone knows something, that there's a single puzzle piece missing. Or maybe it's the faces of the children, Jane's maturity, Arna's curiosity, Grant's energy, frozen in time, pleading not to be forgotten. In the end, the Beaumont children didn't just vanish. They left behind questions, they left behind a legacy, and they left behind a country forever changed. By the late 1980s, the mystery of the Beaumont children had become an indelible part of Australian consciousness. Despite the decades that had passed, the names Jane, Arna, and Grant still echoed through households, their photographs frozen in time on aging posters and dusty newsreels. But in quiet corners, whispers persisted. Each theory, every supposed sighting, continued to feed an insatiable public hunger for resolution. Yet the truth, elusive as ever, remained hidden. In the years following the initial waves of investigation, the case had seen a periodic resurgence of interest. With each decade, new technologies offered fresh hope. DNA profiling, which had begun revolutionizing forensic science in the late 1980s and early 1990s, promised answers where intuition and detective work had failed. But the problem was simple. No bodies had ever been found. Without physical evidence, there was little that even the most advanced science could uncover. Jim and Nancy Beaumont, who had once been symbols of every parent's nightmare, had long since receded from public life. They gave fewer interviews, avoided public commemorations, and quietly moved to escape the unbearable shadow that the tragedy had cast over their every waking moment. The once vibrant photographs of their children were now gently framed in their living room, reminders of a past that refused to let go. And yet, for all their silence, there were moments that stirred hope or dread. In 1998, a man approached the police with an astonishing claim. He believed he had seen Jane Beaumont, grown and living under a different name in a remote town in Western Australia. He insisted her mannerisms, the shape of her face, and even the sound of her voice were eerily familiar. Investigators followed up, tracking the woman he'd pointed to. But after days of questioning and forensic comparisons, the lead fizzled. It wasn't her. It never was. Around the same time, an anonymous letter was sent to South Australia police. The handwriting was jagged, erratic. The writer claimed to have knowledge of where the children were buried, even naming a location, an abandoned warehouse site in North Adelaide. Authorities, desperate as ever, brought in excavators and forensic teams. The site was cordoned off, and television crews circled like vultures. But once again, nothing. The ground yielded only rubble and rusted debris. Some began to suspect the letter had been a cruel hoax. Others believed it may have been a red herring, perhaps intended to draw attention away from someone who feared being caught. In either case, it deepened the anguish. For those still holding on to hope, these false starts were more painful than silence. Throughout the 2000s, technology continued to evolve. Age progression software was used to generate images of what the children might look like as adults. These digital renderings were shared on television and online platforms, rekindling public interest. Tips flooded in, mostly dead ends, yet a few stood out. One particular lead came from an elderly woman who had worked as a nurse in a psychiatric hospital during the late 1970s. She remembered a patient, a man who had come in after suffering a nervous breakdown. He would whisper about children, about a beach, about a promise he had broken. He never said names, but the details matched the Beaumont story too closely to be ignored. When she brought this to the attention of investigators, they scoured hospital records. The man had died in 1982. His case notes were vague, and no evidence linked him to the crime. Another thread, unraveled. Jim Beaumont, still quietly following every new development, once wrote a letter to the police, imploring them not to give up. He thanked them for their persistence but urged discretion. He knew what it meant for a family to relive their worst day every time the case re-entered the news cycle. For every interview, every theory broadcast brought new pain, not just for him and Nancy, but for extended family, friends, and even those who had once been suspects. Indeed, many of the early suspects had either passed away or faded into obscurity. Harry Phipps, the wealthy factory owner and early person of interest, had died in 2004. Years after his death, two men came forward, claiming they had dug a hole on his property around the time the Beaumont children vanished. That claim led to another excavation, this time beneath a concrete slab behind the now abandoned factory. The forensic search was exhaustive. Soil samples were taken. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed. Again, nothing. Still, the public refused to let go. Documentaries were produced, each with a new theory. Was it a single predator who lured the children? A sophisticated child trafficking ring? Or could it have been someone close to the family? Every suggestion was met with debate and speculation, turning the mystery into something resembling folklore. In 2015, an ambitious young detective named Claire Vickers joined the South Australia Cold Case Unit. Unlike many before her, Claire had grown up with the Beaumont story. Not just in textbooks, but in bedtime whispers from her grandmother. She approached the case not just with forensic rigor, but with a fresh perspective, unclouded by decades of failed leads. Claire began reanalyzing every detail, not just of the case file, but of the time period. She looked into social trends, bus schedules, local predators, and even unreported crimes from surrounding suburbs. She mapped potential escape routes, cross-referenced them with traffic reports, and even created digital reconstructions of Glenelg Beach as it was in 1966. Her work didn't lead to a breakthrough, but it did reveal patterns. Certain names popped up repeatedly, often overlooked because they didn't seem relevant at the time. One man, a carnival worker with a history of indecent exposure, had lived just blocks away from the beach and vanished shortly after the children did. Another, a visiting relative of a prominent Adelaide family, had left the country abruptly within days of the disappearance. Both had alibis. But Claire, meticulous and relentless, wasn't satisfied. She reopened interviews with old witnesses, now elderly. Memories had faded, but a few new details emerged, particularly about the man seen with the children that day. Some now believed he wasn't a stranger to the children at all, that he may have been someone they'd seen before, someone who had slowly earned their trust. It was this chilling possibility that drove Claire deeper. Because if the children had known their abductor, it changed the entire narrative. It explained the lack of struggle, the calmness, the willingness to leave without alerting others. This ends not with answers, but with the sharpening of questions. As Claire continues her investigation, the shadows that swallowed the Beaumont children grow ever more defined. And though time has worn away evidence, it has not erased the ache. Somewhere, buried in decades of silence, lies the truth, and Claire Vickers is determined to find it. The Adelaide sky, once burning with summer promise, now hung with the gray weight of time. It had been decades since the Beaumont children vanished. What began as a high-profile case with national urgency had faded into the background noise of a country growing older, but not necessarily wiser. Detective Harper sat at his desk, staring at the last photo of Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont, the picture so many Australians knew by heart. He'd spent years chasing their shadows, every new lead lighting up a hope that inevitably dimmed. But what haunted Harper most wasn't the silence. It was the patterns. The way cases like this quietly multiplied. A missing child in Adelaide in 1973. Another one in 1981. Different families. Same unresolved pain. The Beaumont case had never truly closed. Because how do you close a file on 3 children who simply vanished? Despite the years, Australia had never truly moved on. Memorials had been erected. Investigative reports and documentaries surfaced every few years. A younger generation, unfamiliar with the real-time fear the case had once caused, still found themselves captivated by it. Not because of the sensationalism, but because of the emptiness it left behind. Journalists occasionally returned to Glenelg Beach with their cameras, interviewing older residents and beachgoers who recalled the day the Beaumont children were last seen. Every story began the same way. It was a hot day, the beach was crowded, and then, and always, that uncomfortable silence at the end of the sentence. Nancy Beaumont, the mother, had stopped doing interviews years ago. The media attention, once a lifeline, became a wound that refused to heal. Jim Beaumont, the father, moved out of the family home, retreating further into private grief. By the time both parents passed, Nancy in 2019, Jim earlier, they were still without answers. They never changed their phone number. Nancy used to say, just in case they come home. They never did. Harper, now in his early 60s, was preparing for retirement. He had joined the task force late in his career, but the case had swallowed him whole. He'd gone down every rabbit hole, interviewed every surviving suspect, followed trails that led to derelict buildings, mental institutions, even rumors of underground networks. He was not a man prone to fantasy, but one thing gnawed at him: a pattern of predators operating in Australia during the 1960s and 70s, often with disturbing similarities. His instinct, sharpened over decades, told him there was more than one man involved in the Beaumont disappearance: a ring, a cover-up, a series of victims. And someone had known, or suspected, but said nothing. So Harper did one last thing before retiring. He compiled everything: tapes, notes, phone records, maps, and handed it off to a younger detective, Eliza Tran. "Don't let it die," he said, "because someone's still out there, maybe not alive, but someone who knew what happened, who saw something, who remembers." Eliza, sharp and uncompromising, took the files not just as a handover, but a mission. In 2023, a parcel arrived anonymously at the South Australia Police HQ. Inside was a photograph, faded, aged, showing 3 children sitting on a bench outside a small convenience store. Written on the back in blue ink were the names: Jane Arna Grant, October 1974, Hobart, Tasmania. The handwriting was unfamiliar. No return address. Forensic analysis placed the age of the photo paper as consistent with the 1970s, but no conclusive proof linked it to the Beaumonts. Still, it stirred the embers of the case once more. The photo made headlines. Experts debated its authenticity. Online forums exploded with theories. Eliza took the photo seriously. She traced the storefront, discovering it no longer existed, demolished in 1992. But she uncovered one crucial clue. The store was owned by a man once investigated for child trafficking in New South Wales. Charges had been dropped. No convictions. Eliza traveled to Hobart, dug through property records, interviewed neighbors. No one could confirm ever seeing the children. But one elderly woman, now nearly blind, said something chilling. There were kids like that once, a girl holding a little boy's hand. But they weren't local. They looked scared. I remember because the man with them had such a cold voice. That was all she could offer. Was it the Beaumonts, or another family lost to the same dark current? The case continued to inspire stories, podcasts, films, and theories. But among those closest to it, there was only exhaustion. Eliza kept digging. But the older the case, the deeper the burial. Witnesses died. Records were lost. Suspects like Bevan Spencer von Einem remained in prison but silent, offering no confessions. New DNA technologies were attempted, but no viable evidence had survived the decades. Yet for Eliza, the fight was never about solving it for the glory. It was about restoring dignity, giving the Beaumonts what they never had: peace. A year after receiving the photo, Eliza held a quiet memorial at Glenelg Beach. She didn't invite the press, just placed 3 sunflowers in the sand and whispered, "You are not forgotten. We're still listening." And then she left. But not before noticing something. A child, standing near the shoreline, staring into the horizon. When she looked again, the child was gone, just like before. There was no dramatic conclusion, no late-night confession, no unmarked grave revealed. But something had changed, because in telling the story, in refusing to let it die, people began asking harder questions about institutional failures, about how predators operated for years without consequences, about what we choose to forget, and what we must remember. The story of Jane, Arna, and Grant Beaumont isn't just a mystery, it's a mirror, reflecting how a country handles its tragedies, and whether justice delayed is truly justice denied. Some stories have no ending, only echoes. Some names fade from newspapers but never from memory. Jane, Arna, Grant. They walked into the sunlight of an Australian summer and disappeared into the shadow of a question we still can't answer. But maybe, just maybe, the question itself is the answer. How could this happen? Keep asking, keep listening, because silence is how they win, and we're not done speaking. Some stories don't have endings, only questions that echo through time. If this case moved you, don't let it fade. Hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more unsolved mysteries, haunting truths, and forgotten voices. Drop your thoughts or theories in the comments. Let's keep the conversation alive. Until the next story, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, sometimes the past is closer than we think.